Warning, the $1.2 trillion paper defense. The F-35s are lined up, canopies down, pilots strapped, engines whining. Ground crew freeze. The tablet throws a red banner, digital certificate expired. Cockpits are live. Missiles are cold. The network says no. No hack, no missile warning. Just a timer in software that doesn't care about the weather or the jets or the pilots' faces behind the glass. The clock ran out. To understand why a paperwork timer can silence a trillion-dollar force, we need to rewind. NATO's digital nervous system, planning tools, logistics, data links, runs on contracts and cryptography. Somewhere in those 400 pages, a line became a weapon. The paper backbone, NATO's invisible nerves. Start with the stakes. Every sensor, jet, and missile in a modern alliance hangs on one procedural ecosystem: certificates, signatures, and trust chains. Not metaphors, actual PKI. Device certificates prove who you are. Server certificates prove who they are. Code signing says the software running in the jet, on the tablet, and in the cloud is the software it's supposed to be. If any of those fail validation, the system flips itself to safe. Safe means no-go. Mission data files, the jet's threat brain, arrive wrapped in signatures. Electronic flight bag apps on the ramp check their trust stores before they'll greenlight anything. When those stores age out, the apps throw signature not trusted, even if the files are perfect. The pilot's thumbs up is irrelevant. The machine is waiting for a cryptographic yes. Here's where it got brittle. ALIS, the Autonomic Logistics Information System, was the F-35's original black box. Health reporting, parts authorization, fault rules, mission planning. ALIS touched everything. It needed to phone home to vendor gateways to finish the loop. If it couldn't validate, it didn't just complain. It could hold back airworthiness sign-off. The software, not the squadron commander, effectively owned the last gate. ODIN, the re-architected operational data integrated network, arrived with promises: modular, cloud-forward, edge kits at the base to cut latency. But the fundamentals didn't change. PKI still ruled. Containers carrying rule packs and MDF updates stayed locked unless signatures checked out against vendor untrust anchors. Federated NATO networks relied on cross-signed certs and OCSB CRL responders to validate components across national boundaries. Sovereign flags met private routes of trust. Now add time. Certificates expire by design. Intermediates roll. Routes eventually rotate. That's healthy cryptography. It's also a standing ambush if the rollover window doesn't match the op tempo. One renewal gap can cascade. Edge kits miss the updated chain because a sync was blocked or delayed. Cached CRLs go stale. The offline grace logic isn't as generous as everyone assumed. Dispatch status flips to no-go because the MDF can't be validated. Across the flight line, pilots hold short while maintainers reboot tablets and try manual time resynced. Policy says fail closed. Local workarounds are a career risk unless someone signs a waiver. Meanwhile, the human angle looks like this. Crew chiefs juggling iPads that suddenly refuse to trust yesterday's software. Maintainers on the phone with a vendor NOC asking for an emergency whitelist. A captain watching his launch window collapse by minutes that feel like hours. The error reads simple, unable to validate signature, but that's the surface. Underneath, the device is reaching for an OCSB responder that's in maintenance, or a CRL that hasn't propagated, or a cross-signed cert the edge hasn't learned to trust yet. Hidden leverage lives upstream. Vendors operate the PKI most of these systems trust. They own the code-signing keys that unlock new features and rule packs. They run the update servers. They define change windows. They decide when an intermediate retires and when a new one goes live. Those decisions sit in contracts with tidy phrases, commercially reasonable efforts, scheduled maintenance windows. Security compliance requires fail closed by default. None of those phrases care that your QRA launch sits at 0400 local. And this isn't just an F-35 story. NATO's federated backbone ties together ISR feeds, IFF updates, secure chat, and mission planning across borders. Cross-validation matters because a Danish jet may need a threat library packaged by a US program office and delivered over British cloud region while sitting on a Norwegian ramp. Every hop is another check. Every check is a potential timer. What nobody likes to advertise is how a single upstream outage can ripple, kill or brown out an OCSB responder during a cert rollover, and your data link keys don't provision on time. ISR feeds don't fail dramatically, they degrade. Frames drop to stills. Metadata stops updating. Operators revert to voice for deconfliction because the system won't bless new IFF tables without a validation handshake. Meanwhile, crew rooms grow quiet. You can feel the rules pressing down. Policy forbids bypass unless authorized. Who authorizes? The vendor can, with the right SOC escalation, or a senior commander can, with a waiver that will generate an audit trail. Every path runs slower than a launch clock. Here's the twist. The migration from ALIS to ODIN wasn't just about performance. It was about sovereignty. European partners didn't love learning that mission data and maintenance decisions hinged on gateways they didn't control. But the re-architecture kept the same truth anchored. Vendor routes still sat at the center. Nations could cache. They could mirror. They couldn't own the master keys without breaking interoperability and export controls. The result? Bases learned to fly in degraded connected modes. Cached trust made things work until the cache expired. So yes, the paper is the backbone. It's contracts that define whose keys matter and when. It's compliance that encodes no unsigned or unvalidated software may run. It's SLAs that place maintenance windows on calendars like weather fronts. Put all that into a clock and you get a quiet weapon, a denial you can't point a missile at. And when the timer hits 0, the runway goes silent. ALIS, ODIN, and the maintenance cage. To see the cage, look at the checklist. Airworthiness, health data upload, mission data verification, crypto key load. 4 green lights. Miss one, the jet doesn't leave chalks. That's not a suggestion. It's a rule that lives inside systems people can't see, enforced by software that answers to contracts, not adrenaline. ALIS made that painfully clear. It wasn't just a logistics database. It was the nervous system that decided whether a fault code was noise or a reason to ground the aircraft. Engines reported hours, actuators reported cycles, sensors whispered about last flight anomalies, and ALIS stitched it together with rule packs signed by the vendor. Those rule packs weren't text files, they were signed packages. If ALIS couldn't validate their signatures against a chain it trusted, the rules didn't load. If the rules didn't load, the aircraft's status defaulted to caution or worse. Phone home wasn't a convenience, it was the pathway to permission. Parts were the same story. A valve on a pallet is just a valve. In ALIS, it only becomes a part when the system authorizes it against a configuration control database and an approved supplier chain. That check is cryptographic. The authorization token is signed. If a gateway goes dark during a signature rotation, the token can't be validated. The pallet sits. The aircraft that needs it sits longer. ODIN promised to fix the choke points. Break up the monolith, push capability to the edge, move from slow proprietary gateways to modern cloud services with on-prem kits that cache what you need. In practice, ODIN still had to prove the same things to the same authorities, that the software was authentic, that the rule packs were fresh, that the mission data came from where it claimed to come from, and that the cryptographic lifelines hadn't been cut. The difference was packaging, containers with signed manifests, edge nodes that could operate for a while without calling home. Operate for a while, not forever. Federated bases learn the rhythm. Sync windows at night, cache during the day, fly on the cache when the pipes sputter, file tickets when the cache ages out faster than expected. An intermediate certificate rolls on a Wednesday UTC. A base in another time zone hits pre-dawn sorties on Thursday with edge kits still holding the old chain. OCSB responders flip to a new hierarchy. The old addresses serve redirects that local firewalls treat like phantoms. The kits don't panic, they follow policy. Policy says, if you can't validate, don't trust. Trust is the last gate before a pilot hears cleared for takeoff. Now layer on sovereignty. Allies asked blunt questions. Who owns the data that decides if our jets fly? With ALIS, the answer felt simple and unacceptable. Vendor gateways mediated too much. With ODIN, the answer became more polite and just as hard. Yes, you can keep your data in country. Yes, you can run edge. Yes, we'll prioritize your cloud region. But the keys, the master trust anchors, those live under export controls and program office oversight. You can't just splice in a national root of trust without breaking the collective fabric. So bases learn to live degraded connected. That phrase sounds operational. It really means we can fly until the cache says stop. The contract language sealed the box. Service level agreements carved out maintenance windows. Commercially reasonable efforts floated over everything like a legal fog. Availability targets looked strong on slides, but buried footnotes allowed certificate rotations, back-end upgrades, and CRL pushes on schedules that didn't care about a 4-ship at dawn. Compliance clauses locked in fail-closed by default. If validation couldn't reach an authority, the system must assume tampering. In cyberspace, that makes sense. In a scramble, it turns certainty into concrete. There was a day when a base discovered exactly how much concrete. An intermediate CA rolled as planned. The edge kits expected a new chain, but the sync job missed its window. Network congestion, a firewall rule, pick your culprit. Cached CRLs hit their staleness threshold. The logic wasn't malicious, it was tidy. No fresh chain, no fresh revocation status, no authority, no go. Multiple aircraft flipped red X in the logs. Maintainers tried the rituals. Resync time, swap cables, reboot clients, restart containers. Nothing moved because the trust chain was the thing, and the thing was out of reach. Operations reverted to paper deconfliction, while the help desk escalated to the vendor's NOC. The NOC asked the obvious. Are you within the grace period? The grace period existed to shield vendor liability, not to let the jets fly. Owners and operators wrestled with the same question from different angles. The engineers saw integrity. The commanders saw clocks. Even ODIN's better architecture couldn't outrun a policy that treated unreachable as untrustworthy and untrustworthy as unsafe. In the room, nobody argued against safety. What they argued was who got to decide when safety meant accepting a different kind of risk. By the end of that week, the jets were moving again. The chain propagated, the caches refreshed, the rule packs loaded, the signatures validated. The cage door didn't disappear, it just swung open on schedule. The clause that could stop a war. Want to see the hidden switch? Follow the paper. Buried in procurement boilerplate is a doctrine that outranks flight suits. No unsigned or unvalidated software may run on mission systems without a senior waiver. It reads like safety. In practice, it's tempo control, encoded as law inside machines that don't bend. The clause sits next to export control language that treats certain components like controlled substances. Sensors, libraries, and crypto modules require vendor attestation before they're enabled. The wording is clinical, enablement contingent on validated provenance and current certification status. That's the velvet rope. Without the attestation, the code is there, the hardware is there, but the feature stays dark, no matter what the pilot needs. Now add the part that pretends to be generous. Contracts define a grace period around certificate rollovers, 24 to 72 hours common in the slides. The legal teams call it a liability window. If something breaks during the rollover, the vendor isn't immediately on the hook. Hidden in the next paragraph is the catch. Systems must remain fail-closed until validation resumes. The clock protects the contractor. It doesn't move the jet an inch. On paper, this is how you keep malware out of cockpits. In a crisis, it becomes a legal timer disguised as safety. The cryptographic purity is absolute even when the kinetic risk is screaming. A squadron commander can't wave a hand at the sky and tell the PKI to trust him. The system wants a chain it can see and a responder that answers. If it can't get either, it chooses abstinence. Here's where the leverage tilts. Vendors hold the master routes, the intermediate authorities, the code-signing keys, and the gateways that accept or refuse requests. They schedule certificate rotations and patch windows. They push rule packs and threat libraries. They can flip kill switch flags if compromise is suspected, and they can unlock features if a customer pays for a capability tier. Every one of those actions rides on the same trust primitives. God mode isn't a swagger line. It's the ability to set conditions for flight readiness across nations by touching cryptographic levers in a calendar. ALIS made this leverage visceral by owning the airworthiness gate. ODIN changed the architecture, not the ownership of keys. Escalation paths exist, but they're gated. To bypass validation or whitelist a local cert during a blackout, the playbook requires multi-party approval. Vendor SOC NOC, Program Office Security, sometimes national authority. Each party has its own SLA and risk language. Tickets stack in queues while jets taxi and hold. The irony is thick. Your emergency depends on someone else's business hours rhythm. You can ask for mission mode. You can't compel it. What nobody knew until the annexes surfaced was how deep the cross-alliance dependencies ran. Interoperability documents referenced third-party trust anchors embedded in vendor stacks. A single upstream OCSP dependency served multiple regions under different labels. Sovereign cloud regions were real, but their lifelines pointed back to shared validation services because duplicating the routes blew up export regimes and version control. It looked sovereign. It behaved federated. The Board of Peace later put this in one line: sovereignty in marketing, federation in plumbing. Operators learned this the hard way. During an exercise, a base lost reachability to its preferred responders. They had a national cache. They had mirrors. The cache would have saved them, except a footnote forced aggressive cache eviction to meet freshness targets audited by the vendor. The document didn't intend to freeze a flight line. It just did. Meanwhile, the legal timer kept ticking. Fail closed by default sounds like wisdom because in a spreadsheet it is. But the clause doesn't weigh blue-on-blue risk from stale IFF tables against the theoretical hazard of accepting a signed library you can't revalidate for 3 hours. It simply says no. The waiver exists to handle that trade-off, and it climbs a chain of command designed for peacetime scrutiny. When seconds count, the waiver's speed is an opinion. Inside a small conference room, the arguments got blunt. Lawyers asked, who accepts liability if a fail-open decision leads to loss? Operators asked, who accepts liability if fail-closed loses an aircraft for want of a handshake? Engineers pointed to the spec. Integrity first. Intel officers slid a slide deck showing adversary probes clustering on patch cycles and certificate rollovers. The pattern was obvious. Timing could be weaponized, and the clause gave the timer teeth. One lieutenant colonel told a story that landed. At 03:17, a maintainer missed a prompt during a scheduled rollover. 10 minutes later, 3 aircraft went red X not because anything broke, but because the system couldn't see its new chain. The commander called for a waiver. The waiver needed a signature 2 time zones away. By the time it arrived, the window to intercept had closed. The enemy didn't fire. The clause did. No one suggested scrapping validation. What changed was the question. Did the contract optimize for audit posture or for mission continuity under duress? The answer was buried in phrases like commercially reasonable efforts and security compliance requires fail-closed. Reasonable for whom? Compliant to what risk profile? The clause never imagined a red team riding the rollover window like a tide. So the clause stood, unchanged on the page, but not untouched in minds. Commanders started asking for pre-cleared mission mode envelopes tied to known maintenance windows. Vendors bristled. Program offices split. Some saw prudence, others saw a crack in the dam. The paperwork didn't move that day. The lesson did. A line in a contract can stop a war plan as surely as a missile. And nobody votes on that line once the engines spin. Human workarounds, shadow SOPs under fire. While lawyers argued commas, operators wrote new checklists in pencil. The stakes were viciously simple. Bend a rule and risk your career, or obey the rule and risk the mission. Waiver authority lived in a different time zone. Scramble orders didn't. Here's what the shadow SOP looked like at midnight. A mission data file failed validation because the Edge kit couldn't reach its OCSB responder. The crew chief didn't wait for the help desk tree. He pulled the MDF off a quarantined workstation, copied it to a clean drive, and walked it across the ramp, sneaking it in a world that says don't. In the cockpit, the pilot read out the hash over secure voice. In the tent, an Intel NCO compared it to a pre-staged printout signed the day before rollover. 2 hashes matched. The radio code word, agreed at yesterday's brief, floated back. Library green, method 3. Not perfect. Good enough to fly. Paper returned like a ghost. When tablets refused to bless an app, maintainers pulled out laminated sheets, manual ops checks, known good configurations, emergency timings. The digital green light became a pen stroke from the operations officer authorizing degraded mode under row. Signatures hit a binder with a timestamp and a call sign. The binder would matter later when the investigation board asked who knew what and when. Fallbacks multiplied. Squadrons rehearsed a ladder of validation states. Full trust when the kit could see the chain. Cached trust under time box. Procedural trust when caches went stale during a window the schedule had flagged 3 weeks earlier. Each state mapped to voices and code words. OCSB unreachable, phrase alpha. CRL stale but within grace, phrase bravo. Cross-signed intermediate not learned, phrase Charlie. The pilot didn't need the acronym. He needed a green or a red. He could explain later without lying. Radio filled the gap, data links left. Without live IFF table updates, deconfliction moved to voice. Controllers tightened lanes. Pilots added call and response checks to every turn and altitude change. Row got conservative by default. Blue-on-blue corridors widened, strike profiles stretched, on-station windows shrank. ISR feeds degraded to stills. Targeting cycles slowed to a crawl. Commanders chose presence over precision because presence could be vouched for on the net. Morale took a quiet hit. Flying blind in parts isn't dashing, it's tiring. 3 areas, 3 choices, same glitch. In the Baltic, the wing had rehearsed cache trust operations. When the rollover hit, they flew on cache for a defined window with hash checks on pre-staged MDFs and a strict sunset. In the Med, the base stood down. The vendor's NOC told them to wait inside the liability grace period. The wing commander refused to own a fail open if the board came calling. In the Arctic, QRA got a mission mode waiver, only for alert birds, only for a few hours, only with a stack of signatures that would trigger a level III audit no one wanted. 3 commanders read the same contract. 3 commanders read different skies. Each workaround left a trail. SATCOM chat logs recorded hash exchanges. Photos snapped of binder pages next to Zulu time clocks. Flight line supervisors notarized times with grease pencil boards in the background to prove sequence. Not because anyone enjoyed paperwork, but because everyone feared the post-facto courtroom. Compliance culture didn't vanish, it went tactical. People learned to speak 2 languages at once, get airborne now, and justify it later with enough metadata to survive the inquest. There were lighter beats that cut the tension. A captain started carrying a pocket watch set to UTC because his iPad wobbled between tower time and Zulu during rollovers. A maintainer kept a sealed envelope in his locker, a one-time pad of emergency hashes for the week's libraries, printed when everything was green, signed by Intel and Ops. Break glass, use once, burn the stub. It wasn't officially sanctioned. It also wasn't stupid. But the workarounds weren't free. Every manual hop added human error to a stack built to eliminate it. One missed digit on a hash, and everyone's confidence cracked. One tired admin accepting the wrong code word over a scratchy net, and a spoof slips through. Training struggled to keep up because the syllabus didn't include operate while the trust store ages out. People learned on the ramp and hoped the lesson arrived before the board did. Culture split along a hairline that had always been there. Compliance-first commands waited for green lights, logged perfect paperwork, and accepted grounded jets as proof of integrity. Effects-first commands wrote their own guardrails, flew degraded with discipline, and braced for audits. Neither camp was reckless. Both lived with different nightmares. One feared compromise sneaking in under friendly voice. The other feared watching a threat fly unchallenged while a server somewhere rotated a certificate. The quiet doctrine that emerged was blunt. Fight degraded, decide centralized. You could loosen validation at the edge for short windows under row. You could not invent new routes of trust. You could not change libraries without a record. And you could not normalize mission mode. Commanders pushed flexibility down and pulled accountability up. Unofficially, They also pushed a clock on the vendor calendars and told schedulers to plan ops around maintenance windows like weather. It wasn't heroics. It was survival. Those knights wrote a playbook nobody wanted to admit existed. It lived in coffee-stained binders and muscle memory. It kept aircraft moving when the timer tried to pin them. And it taught everyone the same lesson. The battlefield wasn't just the airspace. It was the calendar. Timing as a weapon, the rollover window. Everything you've heard so far points to one quiet battlefield. The calendar. Clocks, not cannons. Maintenance windows land like weather fronts, and the enemy brings an umbrella. Midnight UTC looks tidy on a vendor slide. On a map, it slices through real life. It's late afternoon in the Pacific, pre-dawn in Europe, and somewhere between both, an alert crew is strapping in. That's the hour the trust stores tick over, the OCSB responders rotate, and caches face their freshness tests. While that's happening in Brussels time, something else is moving at sea. Russian SIGINT trawlers drift near the shipping lanes, antennas up, listening to the routine chatter that stops being routine when services brown out for scheduled maintenance. VKS patrols push just a little closer to airspace lines. In the east, Chinese scanners light up the perimeter, probing edge gateways, pecking at flight planning portals, mapping which addresses respond smooth and which start to redirect. None of it crosses a red line. All of it tests a scene. Quarterly rollovers create a tempo anyone can learn. You don't need a leak to spot it. Open source BGP telemetry wobbles when big providers shuffle cert chains and shuffle back. Darknet sensors see scan spikes within plus or minus 12 hours of those change windows. The pattern repeats often enough to feel like tide charts. In briefings, Intel officers circle dates on a wall calendar. Patch Tuesdays, vendor CA rotations, cloud region maintenance nights. Then they draw lines to exercise weeks, alert surges, and deterrence flybys. The overlap isn't a conspiracy. It's logistics meeting opportunity. Here's where it gets me. The systems are built to fail closed when validation falters. Adversaries don't have to break them. They just have to be there when they bend. A responder under load answers slower. A redirect looks like a phantom to a strict firewall. An edge kit, tuned by compliance, decides it can't guarantee freshness and slips into abstinence. Nobody fires a shot. A CAP launches 10 minutes late. An ISR feed downgrades to stills just as a ship turns off AIS. Controllers add one more radio check to emerge because the IFF table update didn't bless. All plausible, all deniable, all on schedule. Operators tried to outflank the calendar. Bases staggered local maintenance to dodge UTC midnight. Good idea, until the upstream route rotated on the vendor's clock anyway. Some wings pushed for freeze periods during major exercises. Vendors agreed on paper with footnotes. Business continuity demanded back-end housekeeping. Export regimes required coordinated trust updates. The result was a narrow grace channel that still funneled everyone through the same choke point once a quarter. If you flew then, you flew through that throat. Get this, adversary tasking briefs started to look like our own. Reports showed Russian and Chinese units tracking Western change rhythms with an accountant's precision. They didn't need to know what an intermediate CA looked like. They needed to know when the West collectively chose to swap it. On those nights, SIGINT ships loitered where they could hear more. Cyber units turned up low and slow traffic that smelled like weather, not war. If someone tripped an intrusion alarm, it blended with the noise of certificates flipping and services restarting. If nobody tripped anything, they still learned which bases went quiet first and which kept humming on cache. Meanwhile, squadron schedulers learned to treat maintenance windows like fog banks. Launch early to beat the rollover. Land before the cache hits its staleness threshold. Build a wedge of time where you can trust the trust. It worked until time zones shifted the wedge into crew rest. Or a tanker needed to stage from a base that lived under different cloud region. Or an OCSB endpoint the plan assumed would stay up got rate limited by a dozen other bases doing the same dance. Then there's the human clock. Midnight UTC isn't midnight to the admin staring at a dialogue box asking, "Rotate now." He's 3 coffees in at 0200 local, trying to hit a maintenance window that minimizes customer pain. He thinks he's inside the vendor's grace. A base a continent away is rolling jets to the line. 10 minutes between apply and propagate feels trivial at a keyboard. On a runway, it's a hold short. The legal clock hums underneath. Commercially reasonable efforts tolerates brief brownouts during planned change. A nation's deterrence message doesn't. Adversaries know which one wins in court. They time their shadows to that reality. If they get lucky, they watch an alliance pause. If they don't, they learn the contours of resilience. Who cashes well, who caves to the help desk, who runs mission mode when the spreadsheet says wait. The Board of Peace later tried to realign these clocks, staggered expiries, stapled validations, mission mode with auto audits. But the master routes stayed on vendor calendars. There were signs of adaptation. Some units piloted offline OCSB stapling at the edge, pre-baked proofs bundled with updates, good for a known window. Others lobbied for staggered expiries across trust hierarchies to avoid a single midnight cliff. Promising, but partial. The master route still flipped on vendor schedules. Export controls still tied national keys to program offices. The big clock still set the beat. So timing turned into leverage. Not because time is magical, but because complex systems keep regular hours. When your kill chain depends on validations that happen at predictable moments, anyone who reads a calendar can lean on you. And that's the quiet part. This isn't about hacking a firewall. It's about showing up when the lights dim for routine reasons and seeing who stumbles. The timer doesn't fire a missile. It just opens the door. The audit that found the skeleton key. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, an audit team started pulling thread after thread. The mandate sounded routine: assess readiness impacts from recent digital service disruptions. The inbox told a different story: tickets from 3 AORs, same week, same phrases. Trust chain not updated, OCSB unreachable, fail closed by policy. The pattern wasn't a glitch. It was a system behaving exactly as designed. Inspectors opened with logs. Edge kits timestamped certificate rollovers to the minute. They showed caches aging out on schedule, then refusing to bless mission data until a validation source answered. Nothing exotic. And yet, sorties slipped, ISR went grainy, IFF updates queued. The auditors asked the obvious: why did simulations catch this? The test matrix looked solid: malware scenarios, corrupted packages, tamper attempts. But one gap yawned: unreachable validation during a hot alert. No one had modeled the most boring failure at the worst possible time. They subpoenaed emails. Buried chains from vendor engineering mentioned unmodeled risk during chain rollover and assume reachable responders. Program office replies were polite and fatal. Rollover windows coordinated. Residual risk acceptable. Residual to who? The wing logs, read aloud, answered with regex after regex stamped within the same 2-hour span. The auditors coined a phrase to keep it clinical: single points of procedural failure. In practice, it meant the paperwork path to trust was itself a choke point. Then came the annexes. Contracts and interoperability specs referenced third-party trust anchors living inside vendor stacks. One OCSB service, independent on paper, fed multiple regions under different host names. A firewall rule meant to localize validation actually hairpin traffic back to a shared responder. Sovereign clouds looked separated until a diagram showed a spine of validation services crossing boundaries because export controls forbade cloning master routes everywhere. Sovereignty in marketing, federation in plumbing. Tests moved from rooms to ramps. Auditors asked squadrons to replay the week. In one base, they reproduced the failure with a training chain. The Edge kit, configured to the spec, hit its freshness threshold and refused to greenlight a known good MDF. The maintainers did what they'd done that night: manual time resyncs, restart containers, cycle interfaces. The kit stayed stubborn. The rule was simple: if you can't prove it's fresh, it might be tampered. The auditor wrote a line that strung. The system met requirements and failed the mission. They dug into fail-open logic. There wasn't any that survived compliance. A draft concept existed, time-boxed acceptance of cached validations with layered alerts, but it had died in review. The reason sat in legal margins, liability ambiguity under export and safety frameworks. No one wanted their name next to accepted degraded validation when money, politics, and lives mixed. so requirements froze in the safest position for the paper trail, not the runway. Edge Kits revealed another miss. Their cache eviction policies were tuned for connected enterprise assumptions, aggressive to avoid stale trust. In a disconnected op, that aggressiveness created cliffs. The kit could have stapled recent proofs with updates, but stapling had been scoped as a future enhancement. Future meant after integration and export review. Export review meant months. Months didn't match rollovers. The auditors weren't naive. They knew why fail-closed existed. They also knew kinetic risk doesn't pause for back-end housekeeping. They asked for red team data. Cyber teams produced timelines. Probe spikes within 30 minutes of known responder brownouts. Scan volume clustered around vendor maintenance advisories. Low and slow traffic rising as cert hierarchies flipped. The report didn't accuse collusion. It didn't have to. It showed clocks aligning in ways no one planned and everyone could exploit. In a closed session, engineers walked through proposed fixes, stagger expiries across hierarchies to avoid midnight cliffs, pre-stage stapled validations with explicit lifetimes, build dual-route architectures with national and vendor anchors bridged under strict profiles, enable mission mode with a hard cap, say 4 hours, requiring multisig and auto-generating an audit packet for post-facto review. Operators nodded. Lawyers frowned. Export control reps warned about key sprawl and revocation chaos. Vendor reps cautioned against fragmenting trust, which read as losing central control. The draft recommendations split along those fault lines. One camp pushed resilience by design, sovereign PKI bridges, offline validation bundles, staggered rotations, and rehearsal drills that treated certificate rollovers like live fire events. The other camp clung to commercially reasonable efforts, arguing that service robustness plus better coordination would suffice without appending contracts or export regimes. The auditors put both in ink, then added a sentence that would haunt inboxes. Current configurations present single points of procedural failure that can deny mission execution during scheduled maintenance events. Nobody wanted that sentence on the evening news. Program offices scrubbed language, proposed synonyms, procedural concentration risk, validation path dependencies. The meaning didn't budge. A meeting schedule circulated. Stakeholders from 30 capitals, primes, intel, export authorities. It got a nickname, the Board of Peace. The promise was simple: align the clocks or admit you can't. Before the meeting, one more envelope arrived. It held after-action notes from a multinational exercise that collided with a certificate rotation. Timelines matched the red team intel. OCSB responders throttled, Edge Kits tripped, jets taxied and waited. The official line called it routine maintenance overlap. The logs called it what it was, a rehearsal nobody claimed. The audit's skeleton key clicked. The door swung open on a room full of people who finally saw the lock. Field test, a 72-hour accident. The exercise brief read clean: multinational package, staggered sorties, tanker arcs, live you play. The real headline sat on a vendor calendar: intermediate CA rotation at 0000 UTC, expected propagation 6-12 hours. No one wrote collision course, but schedulers saw the overlap and prayed the caches would hold. Hour 1 started with confidence. Edge Kits had pulled the new trust hints during the last sync. Status lights stayed green. Then load hit the responders. Rate limits engaged. Redirects pointed to fresh endpoints that some base firewalls treated like ghosts. OCSB checks stretched from milliseconds to seconds, then to timeouts. The first red banner didn't scream. It blinked, almost shy, unable to validate signature. Maintainers retried. Same blink. The timer had entered the chat. Across 3 bases, the failure looked like weather: spotty, annoying, manageable. A northern wing launched 2 ship CAPs on cached validations inside a pre-briefed window. In the south, ISR birds taxied and held, while the kits insisted they couldn't bless the new MDFs. Tankers lifted on schedule, then got retasked to loiter where someone else's delay created a hole. The sky didn't empty, it thinned. Meanwhile, someone, red team, opportunist, or a familiar face behind a new mask, turned the dial. Probe traffic on flight planning portals rose in the same hour OCSB responders slowed. Nothing loud, lots of persistence. Session pokes, header oddities, login pages measured for timing jitter. Edge gateways saw it, flagged it, and did nothing dramatic because it all lived just below thresholds. In the water, SIGINT trawlers drifted a little closer to where the air lanes tightened. By hour 12, the pattern sharpened. The Med Base's Edge kit hit its freshness cliff and failed closed on a new threat library. The workaround playbook kicked in manual hash checks, code words, paper sign-offs, but the wing commander chose caution. Vendor NOC messages used the same friendly sentence 3 different ways, within the grace period. Grace for liability, not for flights. Aircrews walked back into the tent, quiet and annoyed. In the Baltic, rehearsals paid off. Cached validations bought them a defined window. Controllers added voice calls to cover stale IFF deltas. Pilots flew the lanes like they were narrower than they were, because that's what discipline looks like when the system won't bless your tables. CAP windows shortened, then stacked tighter as tanker handoffs lost slack. The deterrence picture still showed metal in the sky. Zoom out, and the pattern looked ragged. Hour 24 brought a twist. One base finally grabbed the updated chain. Green lights cascaded across consoles. Jets rolled. A second base, same region, watched the same cascade stall at a firewall performing deep inspection on the new responder URL. The fix was a rule tweak that lived 3 approvals away. The help desk suggested a temporary bypass. The security lead shook his head. Change control in an exercise is still change control. They filed the ticket. They held short. Unknown to them, across the ocean, a cloud region pushed a maintenance task that nudged background services just enough to make redirects more common. Documentation said transparent. Reality said jitter. Edge kits, tuned to distrust magic, saw the wobble as uncertainty and leaned into abstinence. A tanker commander, hearing yet another delay call, drew a new racetrack over colder water and radioed the fighters. You've got 6 minutes less playtime on station. Make them count. Hour 36 might have been the worst. ISR feeds degraded from fluid full motion to choppy stills right when a suspect ship blinked off AIS. The analysts stared at frozen frames and made conservative calls. A strike package rerouted to avoid corridors where voice deconfliction felt thin. The exercise script expected tempo. The calendar delivered friction. After-action notes would call it learning under stress. In the cockpit, it felt like dragging a piano uphill. At hour 42, the probes peaked. Telemetry showed scan volume spiking within 30 minutes of OCSB brownouts in 2 regions. Nothing popped. That wasn't the point. The point was to watch who stumbled and when. Which bases snapped to manual hash checks. Which ones phoned the vendor. Which ones had a mission mode waiver ready for QRA only. A reconnaissance of resilience measured in help desk tickets and radio code words. The official line stayed tidy. Routine maintenance overlap. True as far as it went. It didn't mention that routine lined up with the loudest week on the calendar. It didn't mention that the legal grace period looked like a velvet rope across a flight line. It didn't mention how many times a controller said, "Say again," because a data link that should have carried certainty carried silence for 1 beat too long. On hour 51, a base triggered the hidden lever. Mission mode, 4-hour cap, multisig achieved after 3 phone calls and a colonel's steady voice on a scratchy line. The kit flipped from abstinence to a narrow trust state that accepted cached validations with a blaring banner. Jets launched. The system auto-opened a level III audit packet with a timestamp that would live forever. Everyone exhaled and pretended not to count down to the flag's expiration. By hour 60, green returned like dawn. Chains propagated. Caches refilled, redirects settled. The same consoles that had blinked red now glowed friendly. A few crews taxied again just to feel the brakes release. The last 12 hours played out as scheduled sorties that finally met their paperwork. The timer, satisfied, looked away. The after-action huddle was blunt. Tanker tracks had shifted. CAP windows had narrowed. ISR gaps had forced calls that weren't wrong, but weren't ideal. The commander wrote a line that wouldn't make the press. We flew, but we flew blind in parts. Intelligence slid across timestamps that matched probe peaks to OCSB brownouts with eerie neatness. Legal circled, within grace period, on 3 NOC emails and underlined the caveat. Systems remain fail-closed until validation resumes. Nobody claimed credit for the rehearsal. No flag flew over the window. The lesson didn't need a signature. If timing is a weapon, the exercise had been a live-fire drill, except the rounds were calendars and contracts. The jets were fine. The backbone was brittle. And for 72 hours, a trillion-dollar force learned how much that brittleness could shape a sky. Lessons from the 2010s, Crimea to Syria. To see where this playbook was born, go back to the 2010s, Crimea, then Syria, when grey zone warfare learned to love boring switches. Little green men took the headlines. The real action lived in invisible timers, spoofed signals, and backends that hiccuped at the worst possible moment. Crimea set the tone. GPS didn't vanish, it bent. Aircrews watched their receivers drift just enough to doubt their overlays. ADSB targets ghosted, appearing and vanishing like birds in fog. Pilots shrugged and flew the jet. Planners felt it in their fingertips. Mission planning portals slowed, sessions timed out, and authentication pages looped crews back to login. Nobody screamed breach. Everyone noticed that the backend grew sticky whenever the air turned weird. Meanwhile, base networks got taps on the shoulder. Credential stuffing wasn't elegant, it was relentless. Old passwords scraped from civilian breaches tried their luck on logistics portals and maintenance trackers. At the same hour GPS went wobbly, a parts database saw odd query patterns. Catalog lookups at 02, 13, then 02, 19, stepping through SKUs no one needed that night. Not theft, recon. Someone asked, how fast can you order new antennas if your satnav starts lying? Syria doubled down on the method. You lit the sky not as fireworks, but as a hum that nibbled at edges. Data links took a breath between packets. Full motion video turned juddery. And right then, backend sessions for targeting tools expired more often. Operators cleared caches, swapped browsers, cursed the Wi-Fi. They didn't connect the flicker overhead with the login loop on the ground. The adversary did. ADSB tricks proved the timing habit. On nights when vendor maintenance advisories tipped that cloud services would rotate certs, odd transponder echoes appeared near corridors NATO watched closely. Nothing hostile, just noise. Controllers called for crosschecks. Pilots trusted voice. In the TOC, someone noticed the overlap. The same nights the portal asked for fresh auth, the air also asked for more radio. You could say this was coincidence. Then you looked at the spreadsheets. Patch calendars had neat boxes. Exercise weeks had neat boxes. The boxes kissed too often. Parts of NATO's response turned from steel to software because the steel sat on ramps while libraries waited for signatures. Threat updates moved as fast as the slowest validation path. A jet could scramble in 5 minutes. Its brain still obeyed a timer set in a contract negotiated years earlier. The culture shifted one memo at a time. After Crimea, risk registers started listing back-end authentication latency as an operational hazard, not an IT annoyance. In Syria, row grew annexes about validated currency of mission data with time windows that looked like ops orders. Commanders learned to read vendor change calendars alongside NOTAMs. The weather moved from clouds to cloud regions. Procurement didn't keep pace. Peacetime clauses, fail-closed compliance, export attestations, scheduled rollovers, sailed untouched into wartime rhythms. When a vulnerability needed a hot fix, the no unsigned code clause locked the door. When a base wanted to mirror a trust anchor locally, export flags went up. The intent was safety. The effect was a cue. You could feel the frustration in briefing rooms. Pilots with helmets on, legal with red lines out. A case stuck. During a week of elevated tensions, GPS spoofing pushed one package to rely harder on inertial and voice. Back at the planning cell, the backend kicked users at logout intervals cut for security hygiene. Reauth took seconds. Enough seconds stacked to shift a tanker rendezvous by a hair. The hair turned into less playtime on station. The mission still flew. The message was sent with lower confidence than anyone liked. Not every base stumbled. Some began staging resilience like ammunition. They pre-printed hash sheets for the week's libraries. They drilled radio code words that mapped to validation states. They choreographed crew rest around rollovers. It felt absurd to plan a strike around a certificate timer until it didn't. The units that laughed at first ended up copying the binder. Cross-staff floors, dashboards multiplied. SLA monitors, OCSB status tiles, CRL age charts, wall-mounted reminders that deterrence now depended on metadata. Intel briefs started including procedural weather, expected maintenance churn, probable probe windows, cross-checks from darknet telemetry. The hum of the room changed. People who joked about it were now asking for rehearsals that treated certificate failovers like live fire. One more irony: export controls, designed to keep sensitive tech contained, quietly amplified fragility. Nations wanting their own trust anchors found themselves blocked by interoperability rules and program office vetoes. Sovereign clouds existed on slide decks. The trust spine still ran back through vendor routes. During Crimea and Syria, that meant national will met private schedules. Commanders learned the hard boundaries of what they could own. By the time the calendar rolled to new crises, the lesson had settled in. Hybrid war loved seems you couldn't bomb. GPS spoofing and ADSB mischief were just the show. The quiet act lived in portals timing out, logins looping and certs flipping when sorties needed fresh libraries. NATO adapted in patches, binders, code words, rehearsals. The doctrine that emerged wasn't romantic. It was practical. Software readiness sets tempo, and tempo decides presence. In the 2010s, the spreadsheet began to outrank the steel, not because the steel got weaker, but because the spreadsheet picked when the steel could move. Who owns the kill switch? Sovereignty versus service. By now, the question hanging over every briefing wasn't technical. It was ownership. When a jet won't arm because a server won't bless a signature, who actually owns the switch that decides? The badge on the fuselage says nation. The badge on the key says vendor. Digital sovereignty sounds noble until it hits export law and shared programs. Allies asked for their own trust anchors, their own certificate authorities, their own ability to sign mission data without a transatlantic nod. The answer came wrapped in caution. Too many routes fracture interoperability. Too many hands on code signing turn a safety net into spaghetti. Underneath the diplomacy, one truth kept surfacing. The master routes and signing keys lived with the primes and the program office. That's the spine. Everything else hangs off it. Key escrow debates turned every meeting into a courtroom. Operators wanted sealed packages, national keys held under double lock with a mechanism to enable features when the wire went quiet. Vendors warned that escrow widens the blast radius of compromise. Export reps said the quiet part. Some algorithms and libraries aren't yours to sign. You can use them. You can't own them. Sovereign clouds got sold as a compromise. Your data, your region, your oversight. Except the validation path, still hairpin to vendor-run responders, because duplicating master routes across sovereign stacks set off compliance alarms. People reached for the old cure: air gaps. Pull the network plug. Kill switches can't reach what they can't see. It worked on whiteboards. On flight lines, air gapping meant losing the timing that made modern forces lethal. No live IFF deltas, no rapid threat lib pushes, no cross-border mission planning that matches the speed of the sky. Air gaps cured one disease by inviting three others. Bases tried thick edge instead. Pre-stage more, cache deeper, operate longer offline. Better, but the timer still lurked. Caches age. Keys expire. A thick edge without sovereign signing is just a larger waiting room. Costs ballooned wherever sovereignty met service. A national PKI bridge doubles the ceremonies, auditors, and revocation paths. Staggering expiries across hierarchies spreads risk, but explodes complexity. Each reduction in single points of failure created more places to fail differently. Money wasn't the real choke. Time was. Building parallel trust rails while keeping jets flying is open-heart surgery on a moving patient. There was a case that became shorthand. An allied nation insisted on its own route for mission data and maintenance artifacts. They built it, audited it, and brought it to the table with a smile. Interoperability buckled. Cross-certification required a narrow policy profile that stripped out the very autonomy they wanted. Vendor containers refused to run under the national chain. Export controls flagged the bridge as a functional re-signing of restricted code. The wing commander asked, "So who actually owns my go-no-go?" The answer, unhelpful and true, everyone, but mostly the people who hold the keys. Here's the quiet truth that finally cut through the room. Control without visibility isn't control. Some nations were granted view-only interchange calendars, heads-up on rotations, no hand on the wheel. Others got dashboards with green lights and promises. Few got line of sight to the real levers when code-signing keys rotate, which intermediates retire early, which emergency revocation lists would nuke a feature at 0300 Zulu. Owning airframes didn't equal owning enablement. Without that visibility, a sovereign promise was a pane of glass between you and the switch. So who owns the kill switch? In practice, it's a coalition of necessity. Vendors who operate PKI and update gates, program offices that police export and safety, nations that write waivers and accept risk. But coalitions have center and edge. The center holds the keys and the calendars. The edge holds the aircraft and the consequences. That asymmetry shapes decisions. A vendor can accept a brief brownout inside commercially reasonable efforts. A squadron can't accept a missed intercept because an OCSB responder throttled. There were attempts to square it. Dual-route architectures, national plus vendor, bridged under strict issuance policies. Offline OCSB stapling to keep edges green through rollovers. Mission mode flags bound to row, time-boxed, and auto-audited. Each moved ownership an inch toward the flight line. None changed the master fact. Code-signing keys and route hierarchies remained guarded by the same small set of hands, because that's how safety and export were written years ago. In a closed-door exchange that stuck, an Intel rep said, "Our adversaries know who owns our timers." A vendor VP shot back, "And you want us to make it easier to break them?" The room heard both truths. Sovereignty without service is theater. Service without sovereignty is dependence. The only path that felt real was shared custody with rehearsed divorce clauses, clear edges where a nation could fall back to its own rails under emergency, with bounded loss of feature and a plan to merge back clean. It's messy, it's slower than anyone wants, but it's the honest map of ownership in a software-defined force. The kill switch isn't a button, it's a ceremony. And right now, most of that ceremony runs on someone else's clock. Inside the Board of Peace meeting. They called it the Board of Peace because war talk made the invite list nervous. 30-plus governments, primes in dark suits, intel with folders that never opened, export lawyers who travel with footnotes. On the wall, 3 clocks, Washington, Brussels, Zulu. Under them, a 4th clock nobody could see, the one that flips trust chains and starts arguments. The stakes were simple and impossible. Align sovereignty with service without breaking either. The room split before the coffee cooled. Sovereignty hawks wanted national hands on the switch, roots of trust they could own, keys they could escrow, mission mode they could trigger without begging. Vendor guardians warned about entropy. Too many routes fracture safety. Too many signers turn a clean audit into spaghetti. Intel reps said the quiet part. Adversaries already read our calendars. Leaving a single spine of trust is leaving a single point to lean on. Operators started with a proposal that felt like a map, not a slogan. Dual-route architecture, national and vendor, bridged under strict issuance policies so a country could sign its own mission data and maintenance artifacts inside defined bounds. Offline OCSB stapling at the edge. Pre-baked proofs with hard lifetimes bundled into updates so rollovers don't force a midnight handshake. Mission mode bypass codified in rules of engagement. Fail open for a capped window, multi-signature required, auto-generated audit packet that lands on desks at dawn. No magic, just lanes, timers, and receipts. Lawyers circled, who signs risk with red pens. If a nation flips mission mode and something goes wrong, which indemnities fire. If a vendor lets a national route into the trust spine and revocation goes sideways, who owns the blast radius? The phrase chain of custody showed up like a drumbeat. Safety officers added their own drum. Integrity first always. They wanted proofs the edge couldn't spoof, even when the wire went quiet, even when the room got loud. Intel piled on with a pattern the room had seen in headlines, but not like this. probe spikes during rollovers, SIGINT ships loitering when responders brown out, help desks melting while jets hold short. The suggestion wasn't conspiracy. It was arithmetic. Predictable clocks invite opportunists. If the clocks won't move, build bridges around them. Then came the reveal that changed tones. Program reps admitted an emergency override existed in the Edge kits, mission mode, but it was buried under rituals. Multisig from coalition authorities, authorizations logged against national and program office IDs, and a level Roman 3 audit auto-generated the moment the flag flipped. The feature worked. The chill worked better. Nobody wanted a career tied to a log that read accepted degraded validation unless the sky was actually falling. Debate turned tactical. Operators argued the audit shouldn't be a punishment, it should be a beacon. Use it to guarantee post-facto scrutiny while letting commanders keep tempo under row. Vendor guardians countered with the nightmare, distributed routes, brittle revocations, conflicting CRLs that turn a clean fail-closed into a confusing fail-weird. Export control officials raised a palm. Some libraries cannot be re-signed under national chains without rewriting treaties. The floor sagged under the weight of old paperwork. A compromise slid across the table. Partial fixes fast. Stagger expiries across hierarchies so midnight UTC stops being a cliff. Push stapled validations bundled with every update, with explicit good until timers the Edge can enforce offline. Publish change calendars at higher fidelity to national ops cells. No surprises, no euphemisms. Expand mission mode into a documented pathway. Pre-approved windows tied to known rollovers, time-boxed, with named approvers and dead man timers that snap back to strict validation unless renewed on purpose. The operators nodded. The lawyers needed knobs. Who approves how long, what triggers an auto-revoke, where the liability stops. The vendors asked for guardrails, one code-signing spine for executable code, dual routes only for data and metadata, strict profile checks so a national CA can't wander. Intel asked for rehearsals. Treat certificate rollovers like live-fire drills, scripted, timed, graded. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone thought it. If we can't fix the clause, we can at least practice bleeding. Then the sovereignty ask landed, the one that always does. Full national trust anchors, end-to-end, for both mission data and maintenance artifacts. Real control, not dashboards. It died the way it always dies, on rocks labeled interoperability and export control. A dual-route bridge survived in a pilot form, narrow and unsatisfying. Vendor route for code and safety libraries. National route for data pack signing under constrained policy. The center kept the master keys. The Edge got a weatherproof poncho. An Intel colonel broke the polite mood with a line nobody wrote down. We don't need theory. We need lanes to drive through the next rollover. The chair seized it. Action items crystallized. Pilot staggered expiries in 2 AORs. Deploy stapled validations to 3 wings by quarter's end. Publish a red team calendar that mirrors vendor change windows. And formalize mission mode row with multisig and audited caps. Tie all of it back to ODIN fielding schedules, so Edge kits don't relearn Arley-Zera brittleness. Outcome, enough progress to claim momentum, enough ambiguity to keep everyone awake. The master routes and code signing keys stayed with the primes and the program office. National PKI bridges got a toe in the door. The emergency override stepped into daylight, bracketed by warnings and receipts. On paper, political cover bloomed. In practice, the core timer didn't move. As the room emptied, someone taped the new maintenance calendar next to the Zulu clock. It wasn't victory. It was an admission. The calendar is part of the battlefield, and from now on, everyone would have to brief it like weather. The Board of Peace didn't end a fight. It set the terms for the next one. Shadow resilience, grey networks, and paper keys. The official fixes moved slow. The flight line didn't. So units built Plan B in the seams. Grey networks that weren't on slides, paper keys that lived in safes, and rituals meant to keep jets moving without tearing the trust spine apart. It started with parallel cert chains that weren't really parallel, more like shadows. Edge kits couldn't accept new routes, so squadrons pre-staged alternate intermediates vetted during green weeks. Not to replace vendor trust, but to bridge it when rollovers lagged. The packets lived on isolated storage, checksum lists taped inside a sealed folder. When the clock hit a known friction window, a maintainer would break seal, verify hashes against yesterday's known good, and prep the kit for stapled proofs already bundled with the next rule pack. It wasn't rebellion. It was insurance. Paper returned in stranger ways. Intel cells printed one-time pads of hashes for mission data and firmware manifests, OTPs bound to dates and sorties, signed by 2 officers, stored in a red envelope that required 2 keys. If OCSB went dark and CRLs looked stale, the crew chief could call the tent, read the hash, and hear a single syllable back. Green if it matched, amber if the window was closing, red if the cache was past its sunset. No new trust invented. Just certainty stitched from yesterday's proofs. Grey networks filled the gaps command didn't want to admit existed. Air-gapped carts with mirrored repositories, synced only during certified windows, rolled from ops to maintenance like oxygen tanks. Local DNS-pinned responder addresses that had a habit of moving during change nights kept them right where the edge expected them, with a fallback to a pre-approved mirror on the base enclave. If HQ asked, it was resilience enablement. If the vendor asked, it was local caching optimization. Everyone knew the line they were walking. Pre-staged config packs became standard in places that learned the hard way. There were zip files built when the world was quiet, threat libraries, IFF deltas, rule sets, and stapled validations with explicit good until timers. The packs lived in 2 places on the edge and on a cold shelf. Each pack had a playbook card. If the kit refuses online validation during window X, load pack Y, log event Z, notify chain A. 45 seconds of ritual replaced 45 minutes of guesswork. Some units took it further with grey rails, out-of-band paths that could carry tiny bits of truth when the main pipes hiccuped. Not data links, not backdoors. Think HF bursts carrying signed heartbeats or SATCOM sidebands delivering validation staples pre-baked that morning. The payloads were microscopic. A signature block, a timestamp, a serial. Enough to convince a strict edge that its cached trust wasn't a ghost. Enough to keep a jet rolling to the hold line, with confidence measured in minutes instead of shrugs. The impact was real and uneven. Bases with seasoned admins and supportive commanders shaved rollover pain to blips. Others, terrified of audits, stuck to the book and took the full hit. Where grey networks lived, recoveries were faster. Sorties slid but didn't stop, row stayed tighter, and aircrews didn't have to trade precision for presence as often. Where grey didn't, the calendar owned the ramp. None of it came free. Every added lane increased the chance a tired human would pick the wrong hash sheet or misread a timer. A sealed envelope opened 5 minutes early could poison confidence all day. A local DNS pin could outlive its window and turn a fix into a fault. Training chased the improvisation, check rides added, validation degraded drills, sims baked in rollover friction, and young maintainers learned to treat the red envelope like ordnance, handle by checklist, never alone. Culture split again, this time inside squadrons. Compliance-first officers eyed grey rails like contraband, useful today, career-ending tomorrow. Effects-first chiefs treated them as life rafts in seas the vendor didn't sail. The best commands forced a third way, shadow resilience under bright lights. They wrote unit orders that blessed pre-staging, stapled proofs, and OTP hashes within strict lanes. They required dual signatures for every break glass action. They ran monthly rehearsals where the timer failed at random, and a whiteboard clock started counting fuel and patience. Out of that friction came a quiet doctrine you won't find in glossy pamphlets. Fight degraded, decide centralized. Local teams earn the right to operate on cached and stapled trust for short, defined windows. National and program authorities held the crown jewels, code signing, master routes, emergency revocation. Grey networks gave the edge more stamina. They didn't hand it the keys. A micro-story made the rounds because it felt like a fable. A coastal wing took a rollover punch mid-exercise. OCSB checks timed out, CRLs hit staleness, and the primary edge kit balked. The grey cart rolled. The crew chief cracked the red envelope, read a hash into the radio, got green 3 back, and loaded the pre-staged pack. A tanker pilot, hearing the exchange, knocked 3 minutes off his racetrack to buy the fighters a wider lane. They launched on stapled truss and flew their window clean. After landing, the auto-generated audit packet was thicker than the flight plan. The IG arrived a week later. He didn't love the envelope. He loved the signatures, the timers, and the receipts. That's the quiet center of shadow resilience. It isn't swagger or secret sauce. It's bureaucracy weaponized for speed. Receipts ready before the question, lanes drawn before the rollover, culture tuned to treat the calendar like terrain. Gray networks and paper keys didn't break the spine. They braced it just long enough to get airborne when the timer leaned. And they taught a final, uncomfortable lesson. If you can't move the master clock, you learn to live between its ticks. The contract rebellion. The revolt didn't start with a speech. It started with a procurement note in a base inbox. Future buys must operate through rollovers without external validation. That line spread like a password. Program managers who'd worn the last audit like a bruise began redlining templates. The stakes were blunt. Do we keep paying for uptime slides, or do we buy the right to fly when the calendar says don't? Budget is power. A few nations flipped it. New RFPs landed with clauses that read like an operator's wish list and a vendor's headache. Mission mode required, not optional. Offline validation bundles mandatory, with explicit good until timers the edge can enforce without calling home. Staggered expiries across hierarchies. No more single midnight cliffs. Sovereign validation paths for data and metadata, bridged under constrained policy to preserve code integrity. Faster escalation ladders. No more tickets stuck behind business hours while jets hold short. Vendors resisted with a polished calm. They warned about trust fragmentation, audit chaos, and revocation storms. They said dual routes invite drift. They said stapled validations rot if nobody rotates them cleanly at the edge. They said sovereignty can't outrun export law. None of it was wrong. All of it dodged the point. The operators weren't asking for freedom to invent new keys. They were buying guardrails they could drive at speed when the wire went quiet. Alliances felt the strain. Not every capital could stomach higher costs for resilience you hope you never need. Some wanted to ride the old contracts and squeeze more coordination out of maintenance calendars. Others, burned by that 72-hour accident, pressed forward even if it meant flying ahead of the pack. Quietly, new primes smelled opportunity. Smaller shops, born cloud-native but schooled by the audit, pitched edge-first kits with stapled proofs. Telemetry you could export to a national SOC, and change calendars mapped to ops tempo, not vendor convenience. The strategic bet was simple. Pay more now to deny the timer later. One pilot program made the case in numbers, not adjectives. They split expiries across intermediates, bundled OCSB staples into every rule pack, and drilled the squadron on degraded validation lanes. On the next rotation night, green lights hiccuped and then held. Downtime inside the wing fell by 90%. Maintenance balked less. Tankers kept racetracks. The audit packet still printed, shorter, calmer, almost boring. Boring felt like victory. Procurement officers started asking different questions in industry days. Not what's your SLA, but show me your rollover drill video. Not you support sovereign clouds, but which validation paths can my national SOC see in real time? A vendor demoed a dashboard with tiles for OCSB reachability, CRL age, and staple lifetimes at the edge. A colonel pointed at the clock in the corner and said, "Will you move that for us?" Silence said the part the slide didn't. Legal teams fought their own war in margins. They rewrote commercially reasonable efforts into operationally acceptable availability, adversarial wording, but honest. They codified mission mode as a contract deliverable with measurable caps and auto-audits, not a dark lever with stigma. They carved export-safe lanes for national PKI bridges, data and metadata signing under strict profiles, while keeping executable code under one spine. The compromise wasn't elegant. It was durable enough to ship. Pushback found new angles. Some primes hinted that too much edge autonomy invites tampering. The answer was receipts, Dual signatures, stapled proofs, tamper-evident logs streamed to national and program offices in parallel. Others warned of requirements creep. Operators replied with calendars. Here are your rollovers. Here are our exercises. Here, where they overlap. Pick which one moves. When the answer came back, neither, the rebellion hardened. Fragmentation risk was real. A few allies went their own way, writing sovereignty into contracts so aggressively that interoperability cracked in testing. Containers refused to run under local chains. Revocations got lost between bridges. Those stumbles mattered. They also taught the line. Sovereignty for data lanes, not code. National eyes on timers, not hands on master keys. Edge authority to operate degraded, not to redefine trust. Culture shifted inside acquisition shops. The star performer wasn't the smoothest vendor. It was the program that could stand in front of a wing commander and say, when the timer hits, you'll keep flying. Here's the drill, here's the binder, here's the audit receipt template. We've rehearsed it with you, not at you. Metrics changed too. Readiness reports started logging procedural uptime next to aircraft FMC rates. A red, paper-down flag finally carried the same weight as a hydraulic fault. One micro moment sealed the tone. During a big review, a vendor exec said, "We can't promise zero rollover impact." The PM didn't blink. "We're not buying zero. We're buying a playbook that we own at the edge." In the back row, an ops chief tapped a calendar taped inside his folder. 4 circles around the next quarter's change windows. The procurement revolt wasn't about theatrics. It was about owning minutes. The early wins stacked. Rollover drills cut panic to muscle memory. Stapled bundles shrank the window where silence ruled. Mission mode stepped into sunlight with rules everyone could live with and audits nobody feared. New primes earned small footholds by proving they could treat time as terrain. And yes, the bill went up. Resilience isn't cheap. Neither is flying blind. There's still a cliff nobody's moved. The master routes and code-signing keys live where they always have. But contracts can bend the path around that cliff. The rebellion's thesis is short. Write war into the paperwork before war writes itself into your runway. When the timer leans, you don't negotiate with it. You deny it the last word. The human switch, admins, certs, and coffee. All the calendars and clauses collapse into one person at 03:17. He's the human switch, overworked, underslept, staring at a pop-up that says, "Rotate now." He knows the drill. Rotate inside the approved window, minimize user impact, keep the line green. He clicks. Somewhere else, a crew is walking to the jet. The stakes ride on wrists and habits. Password rotations that hit the day before rollover. Cert renewals that stack on patch Tuesdays because that's when the team is staffed. Training modules that teach enterprise hygiene then get stapled onto combat timelines like they're the same thing. They're not. The admin holds a wrench meant for offices and uses it on a flight line. Here's how phishing becomes artillery. A clean email written in the tone of a vendor NOC lands during the rollover week. Action required. Update OCSB whitelist. The link looks right. The timing is perfect. The admin knows better, but he's triaging 5 tickets and an officer breathing on his neck about a green box that turned amber. He almost clicks. He doesn't. He flags it. 10 minutes saved. Or lost. That's the human meter. Back to 03:17. The prompt wants a confirmation on an intermediate CA update. He hits approve. Propagation lags. The edge kit across the base can't see the new chain because a firewall rule needs nudging. The admin tabs to the change request template. It asks for 2 approvals and a rollback plan. He writes fast. Across the ramp, a crew chief radios. Validation pending. The admin sips cold coffee and stares at a progress bar that moves like winter. Training says, never bypass. Reality says, you can shorten the path without breaking it. The best units taught their admins playbooks that breathed, pre-staged rules they could load, stapled validations they could apply, with dual signatures and timers that wouldn't let anyone forget. It turned a single point of human failure into a lane with rails. The admin still sweats. He sweats inside a box that keeps him from guessing. Burnout is its own attack surface. Rotations pile, families wait, and every midnight window drags a day shift behind it. The admin's world becomes caffeine and caution. He starts making fear-based choices. Delay a change because last time the phone rang off the hook. Click through a banner because last time the colonel yelled about holds. Adversaries don't need his password. They need his fatigue to line up with their watch. A micro-story traveled because it felt too small to matter until it did. A woman on nights kept a sticky note taped to her screen. UTC not equal to local. Twice, she saved a base from rolling changes an hour early because the ops board silently shifted to Zulu while her terminal stayed local. The fix was a clock on the wall and a culture that said it's okay to ask, which time are we on? That's not cyber. That's breath. Another night, a junior tech missed a single checkbox. Import new chain after validation. The kit took the update, refused to bless it, and scrubbed the old proof because the cache policy said be aggressive. 3 aircraft flipped red X, the room went hot. The supervisor didn't crucify him. He walked the board, showed the path, and added 1 line to the unit checklist, read back on critical toggles. The next rollover was boring. Boring became a unit metric. There's a quiet skill at the edge, knowing when to escalate to mission mode and when to grind. The admin's voice joins the chain. He's the only one who can say, we've tried every compliance step. The cache will sunset in 9 minutes. The stapled validation is good until 0500 Zulu. Recommend mission mode under row, window 4 hours, log streaming. That sentence is power. It's also cover. He's not breaking rules. He's invoking rehearsed ones with receipts. Phishing drills got smarter too. Not the cheesy fake invoices, but NOC copy emails that used real maintenance phrasing at rollover times. Units graded themselves on who reported versus who clicked. Scores went on boards like sortie counts. Pride attached to the boring win, no clicks during rollover week. The prize was coffee and a nod from the squadron commander. It mattered. Retention haunted every whiteboard. Losing a seasoned admin means losing 1,000 tiny heuristics, which responder usually jitters, which firewall rule hides behind a mislabeled group, which vendor message actually means keep pilots in the tent. Replacements arrive fluent in cloud, but new to clocks that decide flights. The fix wasn't a hero, it was apprenticeship. Pair the new kid with the gnarly sergeant on 3 rollover nights. Let them narrate every click. Turn tacit into script. Patch Tuesdays versus War Wednesdays is a joke until it is. Enterprises pick Tuesdays because that's when help desks are awake. War doesn't pick days. The compromise became calendars that bend. Shift patches to local lulls, move cert rotations off alert cycles, put red team drills on the same map so nobody learns 3 minutes too late. The admin prints that map. He tapes it next to the door. Hidden cost sits where perfection meets scale. 0 defect all the time everywhere with no slack. It looks good on slides. In people it becomes fragility. No room for error, no room for breath, no practice in degraded states until degradation arrives with jets idling. Units that survived taught graceful ugly. They rehearsed failing well. Stapled proofs ready, code words memorized, audits pre-built, and an admin who could say, calm as a tower, timers leaning, execute plan Charlie. And that's the point. The human switch isn't a villain or a savior. He's the last mile of a $1 trillion timer. Give him lanes, clocks that agree, and rituals that buy minutes without lying. He'll keep the green lights honest. Starve him of slack and sleep, and the calendar owns your runway. The timer doesn't care. He does. That's why he's the risk and the fix. Crisis Playbook, how to deny the timer. The playbook starts with a map, the maintenance calendar taped next to the sortie board. If timing is terrain, you brief it like weather. Step 1, stagger expiries. Not just across bases, but inside the trust tree. Intermediates offset by days, responders rotated in phases, staples shipped early with explicit good until windows. That breaks the midnight cliff into rolling hills. No single tick decides the ramp. Next, build sovereign bridges where they help and nowhere else. Nations sign data and metadata, mission files, IFF deltas, rule set manifests, under narrow, audited profiles. Vendor routes still sign code and safety libraries. The edge gets authority to validate the things it needs to fly through a rollover without pretending it owns the spine. It's custody with lanes, not a key grab. Then you drill red team cert failure like you drill fires. Quarterly, not someday. Sim the OCSB brownout, degrade CRLs, Flip a responder URL and start a visible clock. Crews run the ladder. Cache trust, stapled trust, mission mode. Radios use the code words you've agreed. Maintainers load the pre-staged packs. Admins read the timers aloud. Cache sunsets at 0412Z. Staple good until 0500Z. You grade it like gunnery. Fail open stops being taboo when it's fenced. Mission mode is row, not rumor. 4-hour cap, multi-sig to arm, banner in the cockpit, and audit streaming to national and program offices the second it flips. The lever exists. You remove the stigma and amplify the receipts. Commanders don't guess. They invoke doctrine with timers and names. Procurement locks this into paper. Clauses for wartime posture, operationally acceptable availability, stapled validation bundles mandatory, staggered expiries contractual, mission mode deliverable with measurable caps. Commercially reasonable turns into flyable during rollover. Vendors publish change calendars at finer granularity to ops cells. No euphemisms, no surprises. Culture closes the loop. Promote officers who ship resilience you can rehearse, not slides you can admire. Unit metrics track procedural uptime next to FMC. The hero story isn't the captain who hot mics a workaround, it's the squadron whose rollover is boring because the binder ran the room. Calendars move from wall art to tasking orders. There's edge craft too. Offline OCSB stapling standardized, not improvised. Grey rails made official, tiny, signed heartbeats over sidebands with strict lifetimes. Local DNS pins time boxed and logged. Red envelopes replaced by sealed, serialized packs issued per week. 2 keys to open, QR logs to prove sequence. Every shortcut grows a receipt. If they do this, the timer loses its bite. Not because clocks change, but because minutes stop being surprises. Deterrence looks like jets that launch through paperwork weather, with audits that arrive before the headlines, and a coalition that treats maintenance windows as lanes to plan through, not excuses to pause. The calendar remains a battlefield. The playbook makes it ours. The geopolitical leverage of boring things. In strategy briefings, the big arrows get the attention. Fleets, brigades, packages of fighters carving the sky. The leverage often lives where nobody's pointing, in maintenance calendars, certificate ceremonies, and the quiet rituals that decide when software trusts itself. That's the joke and the warning. Small paperwork beats big hardware when clocks align. Adversaries figured out that metadata has a pulse. They don't need to hack your jet if they can read your rhythm. They map your procedural weather, OXP uptime, CRL push habits, vendor advisories, against your public tempo, exercises, deterrence flights, summit weeks. Then they press exactly when your own system creates drag. It's not a cyber Pearl Harbor. It's a thumb on a scale applied at the second decimal place. Allies learned the same lesson from the other side. The fastest way to harden a force wasn't another widget on a wing. It was hardening the plumbing, the trust ceremonies, the timestamp chains, the escalation rituals. That's unglamorous work. It feels like arguing over commas in a clause. Except those commas decide whether you can launch through a rollover with mission data that everyone will sign for later. Sovereignty became a question you answered in PKI profiles and change calendars, not in speeches. Here's where it gets geopolitical. When an alliance depends on a few vendors, routes and code-signing spines, those vendors become strategic terrain. Export controls, audit regimes, and program office rules aren't just compliance, they're power. A country that can't see the maintenance clock can't really set its own tempo. A country that can't escrow a narrow slice of validation for crises can't make credible promises without calling the help desk. Control the paperwork, control the presence. So nations started fighting over boring things, not tariffs, not bases, over where a certificate authority is housed, who witnesses a key ceremony, which side of an ocean a validation responder sits on the night a parliament votes on sanctions. They negotiated staggered expiries like they used to negotiate overflight rights. Diplomats carried timelines instead of talking points. When you put it on a wall, it looked absurd. When you put it on a runway, it looked like jets launching on time. Meanwhile, the other team, Russia, China, and anyone else who studies friction, kept investing where it paid the highest dividend, in awareness of when we blink. SIGINT ships drift when responders brown out. Scanners probe when clouds rotate. Influence ops seed, routine maintenance, narratives during live drills, so hesitation feels normal. You can't sanction that away. You can only reduce the openings and practice moving through the ones that remain. The irony is sharp. The paper defense works until paper gets wet. Compliance protects you from tamper and drift. It also creates single points of procedural failure if you let one path, one calendar, one approval chain decide flight readiness. The fix is still paperwork, duplicate lanes, rehearsed waivers, receipts baked in. You don't throw away integrity. You give it more rails to travel. This is why alliances started hardening metadata. They didn't just encrypt more. They classified change calendars, synchronized rollover drills with ops centers, and treated vendor advisories as sensitive operational inputs. They funded national SOPs to watch the trust spine the way air defense watches the sky. They wrote procedural uptime into readiness metrics and got over the embarrassment of saying, out loud, that the next crisis might hinge on OCSB reachability at 0200 Zulu. Now add AI to the mix. Autonomy promises to take humans out of the loop where humans are slow. It also amplifies whatever loop remains. If your edge logic refuses to arm on stale validation, that's good, until a mass-automated fleet hits the same timer and stands down together. If your autonomy can degrade gracefully, operate on stapled proofs with bounded risk and audible banners, you get speed without brittleness. If it can't, the calendar owns your robots faster than it ever owned your pilots. There's a diplomatic edge here, too. Countries that can demonstrate rollover resilience earn leverage inside coalitions. The wing that flies through midnight without drama becomes the model. Its practices get copied. Its asks in the next procurement fight get weight. Vendors that show transparent calendars and clean drills become strategic partners, not just suppliers. The ones who hide the clock become liabilities at summits. This is the part generals don't love to say in front of cameras. Deterrence has a clerical component. If your opponent believes your jets will pause at predictable moments for reasons that sound like it, your message gets a wobble. If your opponent sees you launch through the wobble with receipts attached, the wobble dies. The whole game is shaving minutes and removing surprises so politics can speak with a full breath. Power used to look like tonnage and thrust. It still does. It also looks like a binder that turns a rollover into a non-event. It looks like a dual-route ceremony video that 3 capitals watched last week. It looks like a maintenance calendar that shifted off a summit because the alliance could actually move it. Hardware shows up on parades. Paperwork holds the line in the hours cameras miss. So yes, the leverage of boring things is real. It's fragile when ignored, durable when rehearsed, and it travels across borders faster than squadrons do. The countries that win the next standoff will still have fast jets and good missiles. They'll also have quiet clocks, rehearsed waivers, and a culture that treats certificates with the same respect it gives fuel. The world won't cheer for that. It will notice when it fails. In the end, alliances don't lose to hackers or hardware. They slip on calendars no one briefed. Control the paperwork and you control tempo, presence, and what your opponent dares to test. If you want the next layer, how sovereign PKI bridges and mission mode doctrine actually get written, subscribe now. And if you want to see how these timers plug into hybrid denial ops in the wild, watch our deep dive next. Your next briefing needs this.